Basically, what I've been asked to do by Miss Basha, whom I do not buck, to tell my story. Very simply put, to tell my story and my own relationship with contemplative outreach. So that's fundamentally what I would like to open up for us experientially. But would like to offer us this particular part of God's Word from the very familiar text from the first book of Kings, the 19th chapter, the 9th verse. We're speaking now of Elijah. Then he came to a cave where he took shelter. But the word of the Lord came to him, "Why are you here, Elijah?" And he answered, "I have been most zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. But the Israelites have forsaken your covenant. They have destroyed your altars. They have murdered your prophets by the sword. I alone remain, and they are seeking to take my life." And then the Lord said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord. The Lord will pass by." There was a strong and violent wind rending the mountain and crushing the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a light, silent sound. When he heard this, Elijah hid his face in his cloak, and he went out, and he stood at the entrance of the cave, and a voice said to him, "Why are you here, Elijah? Be still and know that I am God." God's first language is silence, and everything else is a poor translation. We celebrate this wonderful occasion. It seems to me it's good to be aware that we celebrate this occasion in a particular context, a context that we want to be very much aware of. For we are celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Second Vatican Council. And Pope Benedict has also invited us to celebrate a year of faith, an opportunity through the eyes and the ears of faith to reflect back upon the impact of the Second Vatican Council. And I'm old enough to remember going through that magnificent event in the life of the Church, and recall very vividly, and this is very important for us, recall very vividly that when Pope John the 23rd convoked the Vatican Council, he was very, very clear in stating that the council was not a council of reformation, having to correct some errors that have been pretty much the way in which a council would be convoked over the centuries. But this is what I want you to recall. Blessed Pope John said that this is a council of renewal. The renewal of the Church, the renewal of the people of God. Very, very important to be aware of that. To be open and continue to be open to that wonderful movement of the Holy Spirit that ultimately is going to make all things new with our consent. As we reflect upon the year of faith, we are also invited to be aware that, and this would be the fruits of our centering prayer practice, that we are very much aware that we are called to participate in what Pope Benedict describes and what Pope John Paul II described as the new evangelization. Proclaiming, and witnessing to the transformative power of the gospel message. And to be able to proclaim that fundamental experience through the gift of our being, just who we are, and in all that we are called to do. So that's the context that I just want you to kind of, wow, isn't this something? That you would be celebrating a 25th anniversary against this backdrop. Make the connection. This isn't just an isolated get-together. It's very, very interrelated, very interconnected. I mention the Second Vatican Council because of its profound impact on the life and ultimately the ministry of Father Thomas Keating, our beloved founder of Contemplative Outreach. And Father Thomas went on to relate this experience probably in 1983. I'll say more about that. But Father Thomas went on to share that in the early 70s, the council ended in 1965, and in the early 70s, the Cistercian community, Father Thomas's Trappist community, there was a general chapter. That's the gathering of the leaders of the Cistercian community. They gather every 6 years, as do every religious community, for what we describe as a general chapter, an opportunity to reflect upon the quality of our life and also how God may be calling us to respond to future challenges, present and future challenges. And during one of these occasions when we participate in a general chapter, and this happened with Father Thomas in the, as I say, the early to mid 70s, Pope Paul VI, the Holy Father, chose to meet with the abbots of the Cistercian order that had gathered from around the world. So the Holy Father is now in the early 70s addressing all of the Trappist abbots throughout the world, of which Father Thomas at that time was the abbot of St. Joseph's Monastery in Spencer, Massachusetts. And here's what our Holy Father, Pope Paul, said to the Trappist monks. He begged them to help the Church recover the contemplative dimension of the gospel, to retrieve and to recover, renewal. And so Father Thomas came back to St. Joseph's, now again, early 70s. And the gathering of the Trappist monks, usually on a weekly basis, is what they simply describe as chapter. It's really a community meeting. And so they gathered together, and Father Thomas went on to share with his brother monks what had happened at the general chapter, and particularly what Pope Paul VI said to the Trappist abbots by way of challenge, to help the Church recover the contemplative dimension of the gospel. So how did the monks in Spencer respond to that challenge? At that time, living at St. Joseph's in Spencer, Mass, were Father Thomas Keating, who was the abbot, and Father Basil Pennington, and Father William Menninger. I refer to them as the Big Three. Now, I think it's very helpful to be aware that for many, many years, Father William Menninger embraced the cloud of unknowing, that 14th century spiritual classic. He embraced that through his practice of Lectio Divina. In other words, Father William absorbed interiorly the teaching of the cloud. And it was from the teaching of the cloud that Father Thomas and Father Basil and Father William began to draw out of this spiritual classic the very simple steps that we identify today as the practice of centering prayer. That's how it emerged. That's how it originated in the early 70s at St. Joseph's Abbey in Spencer, Massachusetts. And then, as these three great spiritual teachers began to pull together this teaching from the cloud, including the simple steps of this contemplative practice, the monks at Spencer began to hold weekends, centering prayer weekends. Again, in the 70s into the early 80s, until Father Thomas was transferred or chose to move to Snowmass after he resigned as abbot of St. Joseph's. So it was on that occasion in the probably 77, 78, I had the opportunity to participate in those weekends. I went 2 years, and at that particular point, the emphasis that the monks were offering was the opportunity for the religious men and women of New England to gather together at the monastery for these Thursday night through Sunday experiences. And I have to tell you, I was stationed in Washington at the time at our Theologate, and I would come up for these weekends, and they were just wonderful. Wonderful. Just to be in the monastic setting, to have these spiritual teachers share with us the conceptual background that supported the practice, to have the opportunity to center with other men and women dedicated to God. Does it get any better than that? No. It was wonderful. But I couldn't sustain it. Why couldn't I sustain it? Because in 1976, I had the opportunity to participate in a 30-day retreat, an Ignatian retreat, at the Jesuit retreat house in Gloucester, Massachusetts. And wow, it was a wow experience. And for my director was Father William Barry, and just led me through the Gospel of Mark. You know, every day you would have a meeting and you'd be given some direction in prayer, and it was just a tremendous experience, a real watershed moment in my life. And so I was very much into a more meditative, more active way of praying the Word of God. And so that when I would go to Spencer for those 2 weekends in 77, 78, after the 76 experience, while I was in the atmosphere and the climate of the monastery with others centering, it was wonderful. But then when I went back home, back to my community in Washington, and I would begin to attempt to center, I simply moved into an active mode of meditation. I just say that to you because that's how I began. I just could not sustain it on my own. And frankly, I didn't feel bad at all because I was still very attracted to prayer. You pray as you can and not as you can't. And so it didn't cause me any particular crisis. So that would have been 1977. Now fast forward 1981. In 1981, I was transferred to a new assignment in the Archdiocese of Miami. And I was the director of formation for the lay ministry, the Ecclesia Lay Ministry Office, that was begun by Archbishop McCarthy of happy memory and Mercedes Scopetta, very well known in contemplative outreach circles. And so Mercedes was the director of the office. And so I began there in 1981, and it was, again, a wonderful experience. We were offering, at that point, a 2-year program, educational, formational program for our Catholic laity throughout the Archdiocese. So we would go out and go to various centers in the Archdiocese to bring our program. And it was wonderful, and I loved it. And that was in 81. And then in February, here's where it gets interesting. In February of 1983, I was sitting in my office in the lay ministry office at the pastoral center, and Mercedes came into my office and said to me, "Do you know anyone who we might invite to be a keynote speaker in September of '83 for our lay ministry convocation?" Every year we gathered the laity from the Archdiocese, and similar to this, and had a wonderful celebration, but always would have a keynote speaker. And so I had just put down an article that I had read in Review for Religious by Basil Pennington. And in that article, Basil was waxing eloquently about Father Thomas Keating and all that he was doing in terms of this centering prayer movement. And so just because I had put it down, and Mercedes came in and she said, "Well, who do you think we might invite as a keynote speaker?" I said, "Well, why don't you invite Thomas Keating?" And then I added to my encouragement, I said, "He won't come because he's a Trappist monk and they don't travel." So Mercedes said, "Oh, I know him," and she had been in a meeting with him, and so she left the office. And I was preparing for an evening program up in Broward County, and kind of finishing that up, and just getting ready to leave the office around 4:30 to go home and get a bite to eat before I went up to Broward. And Mercedes came into my office and said, "Well, he's coming." So here he was our keynote speaker for our lay ministry convention in September of 1983. And then Mercedes said, "And you know, when I was talking with him, he invited Mercedes to participate in this 14-day contemplative retreat experience that Father Thomas was putting together, and it was going to be held at the Lama Foundation in the San Cristobal Mountains in northern New Mexico." And then Mercedes went on to say, "But I can't go." She said, "Because my daughter-in-law is expecting in August and I have to be home. Would you like to go? Would you like to go?" And as God is my judge, my witness, I hemmed and I hawed, because that particular July of '83, I was going to Mexico to live with a family, to do what I could do to learn Spanish. I was in Miami, for God's sakes, it's the first language. So that was 5 weeks. And then the only opportunity that I would have to go up north, I'm from the North Shore in Massachusetts, and I love the ocean, and I was dying to get up north for a little break. I said, that was the time of the retreat. Let me pray about it. And I knew that. And so I went home. I went back home, and I went, had a little bite to eat, went up to Broward, and I came back home that night around 10 or 10:30, And literally, this is the honest to God's truth. I'm sitting in my chair just before I went to bed. And the thought went through my head and my heart, you will never have another opportunity like this in your life. Whose voice was that, you know? So anyway, I went in the next day and I says, yeah, thank you very much. I'd love to go. So that's how you talk about God writing straight and crooked lines, you know, just in terms of my own life. So there I was in 1983, in August of 83, coming together at the Lama Foundation with 11 other people, many of whom you know, Gail Fitzpatrick Hoppler, Carla Rico, David Frenette, Mary Morosky. There were others that you probably wouldn't be too familiar with, but there were 12 of us. And so here we were in this, it was an interreligious foundation, and they had a little retreat center, and they would make that retreat center available for people who wanted to come for retreats. So Father Thomas took over the little retreat center, and that's where we gathered. Now, I'm not very good visually, but here, just try to imagine, here you are, here I am in the mountains of northern New Mexico. I mean, just raw beauty, no electricity, no indoor facilities. My life was reduced to utter simplicity. And then you move into the rhythm of the day. That's the external. You know, it was all vegetarian too. Ugh. But anyway, strike that. But the flow of the day was very similar to what many of you have experienced with the, the post-intensive, intensive. We get up early in the morning and have a three 20-minute sit with a contemplative walk in between. Just try to appreciate the rhythm that you've all experienced. And then there'd be a little bit of a break before breakfast, then we'd have a silent breakfast, and then between 9:15 and 9:30, Father Thomas would gather us together for a conference. And the conference would go anywhere from an hour to an hour and a half. And basically what he was presenting to us has all been published over the years. It was the very beginning of open mind, open heart, invitation to love and intimacy with God, the basic material. And he was sharing this with us in the context of a conference every day, some of the richest material on the spiritual journey that I had ever experienced. So it was like absorbing this wisdom. It was just such a pure gift. And then there'd be a bit of a break, and then another triple sit, and then lunch, and then the afternoon would be rest and or soul friending, and Thomas made himself available to visit with us each day, you know, those of us who would sign up. And then a latter part of the afternoon, another triple sit, and then Eucharist, contemplative Eucharist, and then supper, and then unlike our silent retreats, we would gather at 7:30, and it would be more an opportunity for faith sharing. But basically, my experience, it became an opportunity for Thomas Keating to share his vision, to share how he really could see Pope Paul's admonition, help the church recover the contemplative dimension of the gospel. So the seeds of contemplative outreach and seeing this fundamentally as a lay movement, that this is really where he wanted to put the emphasis. And he had Mary Morosky there, who, in my humble opinion, was the co-founder of Contemplative Outreach. They were like hand in glove, just bouncing off one another, this wonderful vision. Mary had done so much in her own life and brought that experience to this particular region. So that was the 1983 experience, 14 days, and for me it was as though I were plunged into the deeper water, and the practice of centering prayer took root in my heart. And since that time, I have been a daily practitioner of centering prayer, and without sounding arrogant, I hope all that has happened for me over these last 30 years is to increase the amount of time. Does that mean I'm retired? No. It means increasing the amount of time in which you are allowing yourself to become aware that at the end of the day, we are grounded in the love, in the presence, in the action of God. And it is from that center that we move out. So I came back to Miami and came back to the office, and that would have been in September of '83. And everyone on the staff were all excited and what happened. And I began to share with them, and we began within the office to explore and to experience this little practice at the beginning of our meetings and things like that. And then a couple of people said to me as time moved on, now we're into September, October, November, when are you going to begin a group? When are you going to begin a group? And I didn't feel drawn to do that. I had quite enough on my plate, thank you very much. And but the persistence continued, and so finally I said, early in '84, probably February or March of '84, I said, all right. I said, let's begin a group. At that time, Mercedes had a house of prayer in Coral Gables that belonged to her family that she made available to the Archdiocese and to the lay ministry office. So we settled on a date and let the word out, and we probably had 30 or 35 people that gathered together for that first introductory, the beginning of a stable centering prayer group. That would have been in, let me say, March of 1984. And then eventually that little prayer group moved to St. Thomas Parish in Miami. And then in 1980, so not too much happened during that first year. There was this prayer group, a couple of introductory workshops, so the beginnings of other small prayer groups. But here was another major shift. It was in 1985, and the word was out. The St. Thomas University in Miami was sponsoring a contemplative weekend retreat that was going to be led by Father Basil Pennington. And then Father Pennington was going to remain for a study week, a contemplative study week sponsored by St. Thomas University. I was away at the time. I don't know where I was, but I could not participate. And so anyone that I had met after the event were just raving. It was wonderful, the retreat was wonderful, the study week was wonderful, and so there was a lot of good publicity around that. And then in July of 1985, in the Miami Herald was an article. In the article, the reporter writing the article had participated in the weekend retreat, and she interviewed Father Pennington. And so she wrote this beautiful article in the Miami Herald about this centering prayer, this contemplative experience, the study week, and she's getting also incorporating into the article Basil's enthusiasm for promoting the practice of centering prayer. And then at the end of this very enthusiastic article, there was a little block at the very end, and it said, and I kid you not, it said, if you want to know more about centering prayer, call Father Bill Sheehan at the Office of Lay Ministry. And I had been up in Broward. I stopped into, we have a parish, St. Stephen's in Miramar, And I stopped in there overnight, and I was reading the Sunday paper. I said, oh my God. I said, wow. Well, long story short, we received over 150 calls that came into the lay ministry office wanting to know more. So what I had said, because I called them early Monday morning and said, get ready, I don't know what's going to happen. Did you see the article? So anyway, we were prepared as you could be prepared, and I said, well, get name and phone number. Some way we can get back, for a follow-up. And so, as we got all of that information, I decided a little later, it was either the end of July or the first part of August, we had indicated when we called the folks back that we would hold a meeting. Any of those interested could meet at the Family Enrichment Center in North Dade. And we had 70 or 80 people that came together. So that, to me, was the real beginning of some genuine enthusiasm. So at the Family Enrichment Center, we would hold a monthly day of prayer. People would come and we'd have a couple of periods of centering prayer, a little input, some lunch. And then from that seedbed, a great deal of interest in introductory workshops on the parish level. And then from that seedbed, we had 2 retreat houses in the Archdiocese, the Senecal Retreat House in Lantana and the Dominican Retreat House in South Miami. And so these 2 retreat houses also became the locus for weekend retreats. And so we were able to kind of, open that up. And then from those weekend retreats came an interest for longer retreats. And so between 85 and 88, we were able to invite Father Thomas Keating to come once to the Senecal and once to the Dominican Retreat House to lead a longer retreat. And then I was transferred in 1988. I was asked to go back to our novitiate out in Illinois to be on the staff. So after 8 years, I was preparing to leave Miami. But before leaving, we put together an advisory board for contemplative outreach, because at this point, contemplative outreach was beginning to germinate. And so that's how I left. I felt, I left the situation in very good form. Wonderful people on this advisory board who were not only practitioners, but allowing themselves to be trained as presenters and so on and so forth. So that brought us to 1988. And then even from my place out in the novitiate, I would come back to Miami for the weekend retreats, for the longer retreats. And it was in the later, 88, 89, that I first met Sister Claire Gregg, who was here at San Pedro. And Claire and myself and Monica Freeman, I remember one year, held a longer retreat at St. Vincent de Paul Seminary in Boynton Beach, and then another time in Miami. So I could see in my comings and my goings that the seedbed was really developing in not only in Miami, but in Central Florida, and also in St. Petersburg and Tampa and that whole area. So that for me has been such a gift. And I continue to be very, very involved in contemplative outreach. I've always, I'm an Oblate of Mary Immaculate, and have always had a particular assignment within my own community, whether it be in formation or I was in a parish for a few years. And in 2001, I was at that point out in Chicago at our House of Theology, and I was asked by our provincial if I would help to begin a new community and back in Massachusetts. And for the first time in 37 years, when I returned to Massachusetts to this new community, my full-time ministry was retreat ministry. And so that's since 2001, that's all I've been doing. If I were to give you a percentile, probably 75-80% of my time is devoted to contemplative outreach, to centering prayer, to the various spiritual practices, the forgiveness practice, the welcoming prayer practice, Lectio Divina. Because what's happened when you simply look at Pope Paul's invitation, help to the Trappist, help the church recover the contemplative dimension. Well, that's what's happening. And all of these practices, rooted in centering prayer, but the practices outside the time of centering prayer, all of those practices that bring us from the head to the deepest level of the heart help to make us aware of the contemplative dimension of the gospel. And so that's what we're rooted in, that's what we're grounded in. And so Thomas Keating is our revered founder, began this process, has been a constant inspiration and guide. When you look simply at the amount of material that he has published over the last 30 years, and I could go through and dissect, various threads in that material that represent tremendous growth, deepening, shifts that are taking place that in the teaching itself. To me, it's awesome. I cannot say enough about that in terms of my own gratitude to God for the gift of this person in my life and in the lives of all of us. Pure gift. So here he is, 90 years old in March, and on October 16th of this year, October 16th, Father Thomas will be traveling for the first time in about 2.5 years, going from Snowmass, Denver, Aspen, Denver, to Boston. Where? Not to the cathedral, but to Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he will sit with Brother David Steindl-Ras, a Benedictine monk who has also been pure gift in terms of the contemplative dimension, and the Dalai Lama. So are we making a difference? So that's it. That's all I have to share. Good.